and the transcript. I think, there we go. Hey everybody, this is the OGM weekly check-in call on Thursday, April 7th, 2022. Today we are on the topic schedule. We didn't do that much topic generation, except this morning there were a couple topics proposed on the Mattermost channel. Eric R. You had proposed one that's sort of kind of the conversation that Klaus and Sam and others have been having about local food generation. And then John Kelly, who I hope will join us, proposed a question that's sort of interesting in the back of my mind and fits nicely with other stuff that we're doing, which was about what is the role of Indigenous wisdom and Indigenous people in trying to find a path forward. And I'm paraphrasing it poorly, so I think the better answer is for me to read out loud what he said. He said, how can or should an Indigenous perspective, however defined and understood, inform and enrich our sense-making around our shared challenges? Among the sources, Sand Talk, Dawn of Everything, and the inclusion of Indigenous people in our various planning and pilot projects, which I like a lot. And all of the floor is also open for other suggestions for topics that we would like to dive into.
It's been a while that I've been on Mattermost, so I couldn't find my passport. Password. So then I wanted to propose one, which is yesterday. I would like to talk about yesterday, the meeting of
the Meta project.
The kickoff, the Meta kickoff.
Just to throw in a line from Sand Talk, if I'm remembering correctly, he says, for the purposes of the thought experiments in this book, an Indigenous person is anyone who has memories of living on the land in a sustainable way. If that's your culture, that you live on the land in a sustainable way, which actually I really like, because it broadens out and reminds us that it's not just Indigenous people. There's still many people who are non-Indigenous, but who live very close to the land and do so in sustainable ways. So I feel like that actually broadens out the inclusion factor. So.
Thank you. And also, go ahead, Klaus.
If I may throw in one day, I think about Japan. Has lived for
we can hear you fine.
Then just decided to
your headset conked out.
Yeah. So think about Japan, which has been sorry about this, which has been living on the same island for thousands of years. So think about Germany or France or Israel, the Middle East, and so on. So Indigenous knowledge is embedded in all the cuisines around the world, learning how to live as one with nature, and they continue to do so. I mean, this operation of being divorced from land is really symptomatic for Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the United States, immigration countries, where you had many cultures all together. And they never really settled back down into here's how we need to interact with our environment. It was always move on and find a new piece of land. So Indigenous in this sense, I think we have to really broaden that idea, into a larger context.
Stacey?
So just to connect what Eric brought up with John Kelly's question, something that I didn't say yesterday, I was uncomfortable on the Meta call, is that one difference that I see when everybody was talking about the fear they had is that Indigenous communities is a much greater belief in the ancestors being the spirits and really being alive. And I think that, I know for me personally, the idea that I'm going to continue on doing whatever I'm doing, and that whatever I do in this lifetime, I take with me and it's cumulative. I think that affects the way we make decisions. And that might be something to look at, because in Indigenous communities, there's a certainty of the continuation of the spirit.
Yeah, thank you. Gil.
Yeah, I really like the definition that Ken shared from Sand Talk, because it carries the mood of an invitation, of a possibility to step into that mode of living. It's not just a historical definition. So there's something very sweet about that. I've been finding myself thinking a lot about this in a way because I'm sorry, I forgot to put my camera on because I forgot because I'm thinking a lot about what might it be like if we did business or in fact did everything that we do as though we actually belonged to the living world. And that feels to me like another way of thinking about indigenousness or indigeneity, whatever the word is that, belonging to the living world, belonging to something larger than personal identity, being embedded in the matrix of the living world, which produces a different kind of attitude to being that echoes what Stacy just spoke to.
Mm-hmm. And you just reminded me that I had run across a poem by Robert Bly that I wanted to read at the start of this call before I knew what the topic was going to be. And now it turns out that the poem is very nicely suited to our topic. So I'll put a link to it in the chat and then I'll read it. So it's Wanting Sumptuous Heavens by Robert Bly. No one grumbles among the oyster clans, and lobsters play their bone guitars all summer. Only we, with our opposable thumbs, want heaven to be and God to come again. There is no end to our grumbling. We want comfortable earth and sumptuous heaven. But the heron standing on one leg in the bog drinks his dark rum all day and is content. Funny how poems sometimes just find their way to a conversation. Eric.
I'll have to reread that one.
I can read it again. It's short if you'd like.
No, but can you put it in the chat otherwise?
I did. It's in the chat.
I'll look at it later. I take time with poetry, so
yeah.
So I was in the New Story Summit that was in Findhorn. In Findhorn, that's like a place where a lot of New Age started, but also a lot of influence, like really big social change people came through. And I think the New Story Summit was one of these times where there were these like huge people coming through, and I found a way to wrangle myself in to be part of it. And it was weird because they had a lot of emphasis on ancestry and ancestry things that would inform us and rituals and all that kind of stuff. And I can see deep value there. And I can also see kind of a trap of just staying in this kind of like magic realm where everything seems right, but nothing really happens actually. And it's, for me, I've had a lot of deep inspiration through tribes. So I've done a course where they talked also about an Indian tribe that had, for instance, like two myths of creation, which rationally you kind of have, but it's about the connection. And I think the most important there is connection. Like, why do we like to talk about stories and stuff? It's because of the connection. And I think I would love to practice connection itself. Like when you read a poem, it's a deeper kind of connection. Yesterday also in the call, we had this moment of silence that creates a different kind of connection. And I know in the Global Ego Village Network, that's a normal thing. They take these kind of times to connect to each other. That's really nice. So that's one part I would like, but also I don't want to estimate how it's going to help us go through, like, subvert global catastrophe. I don't think it will really work that easily. But the part where it's about finding connection, yes, but then it's about finding connection, not about taking an opinion of a tribe or taking in a vision. No, it's really about creating a connection in a group of people. And that could be through those tribes. That's my 2 cents, you call that? Yeah.
We do. Thanks, Eric. John, did you want to jump in?
Sure, thank you. And I was a little late coming in. I'm very happy that the prompt got picked up and you're running with it and you're taking it places I hadn't thought of. That's the role of a prompt, is to get you where you didn't know you needed to go. two look kind of like minimalist ideas. Well, minimalist in the sense of, what do I mean? I mean, some people on this call leap into the indigenous identification and go right for the, oh yeah, of course, you know, and other people raise concerns, you know, like, well, wait a minute, you know, there's beliefs here that seem insubstantial, and I can't identify with those beliefs, and blah blah blah, you know. But I want to back it up to the minimum, you know, and it relates very well to Eric's point. A minimum idea is we don't have enough. We don't expand enough in terms of allowing in ideas that are less familiar to us and are less comfortable. So at a minimum, allowing in more indigenous thought would kind of jar us out of our stuckness. Then there are actually skills, and you've already kind of referred to this in terms of the relationship with the land. In other words, you know, we know that Native Americans did a much better job of managing forests, you know, than our Forest Service. So there's some very specific technical kinds of things where you could say, okay, here's a skill set that we lost. Let's bring that skill set back in, and let's in fact put the people who have that skill set, you know, make them more active in acting on it. So this is a kind of minimalist positive intervention that comes from adding an indigenous perspective to what you're doing. And what Eric brought up is kind of the thing that bringing in indigenous perspective to us was designed to cure, which is don't get trapped in it. And he points out, you know, people can get trapped in that perspective where they're overcome by the experience, the emotional depth of the connection to the ancestors, and the emotional depth, the connection to the spiritual story, and that they stop acting, you know, on the things that are right in front of them. So that's a perspective. I got some other things to say maybe about Ukraine, but I'll save those for later if the window opens up in which they're relevant.
Thanks, John. Brief interruption. I tried again using this skinny down OBS version to broadcast my brain as my background, and it worked. Suddenly, like, the resolution is far better. I don't really know what got fixed or what happened, but I'm going to try this out now and then by not interrupting and taking over the whole room, but I'm going to be curating our conversation. So I just went to a thought that I care a lot about, and I put in some time ago. We used to know how to live in community on the commons. And there's a bunch of things around this. So, you know, to the point where indigenous tribes around the world were actually managing landscapes. And then somehow we turn the commons into natural resources to plunder. So I will sort of come back and forth with that as we talk. And the thought for today's call is here, which is connected to all of our Zoom calls, which are here. So you could go back and you could go to any one of our calls. So here's a random call where we talked about the book Franchise, about McDonald's and Chef Jose Andres and Calvin Ball and the alleged pretendians list. So with that, I'll go back to Pete Forsyth, sorry.
Oh, thanks.
We're gonna have to distinguish a lot on this call.
Yeah, so I guess the thing I have to say, you know, I just want to kind of caveat with, like, maybe this is just obvious to everyone on this call, and if so, please feel free to just move on, but I don't think I've heard it stated. It seems like well, I guess sort of maybe a simplistic thing that I often hear is like, you know, well, if you want to sort of know how indigenous traditions or practices could impact something, well, just ask indigenous people. And I think there's some truth to that, but it's not necessarily a useful thing, because like before you can really like credibly ask someone about something sensitive like that, like you kind of have to be in community with them. You know, you sort of have to be in a position to ask and to be able to sort of expect a reasonable answer. And also the asking is probably not like a one-time transaction, but more like a conversation. So I just wanted to suggest that like there are many ways, you know, at least where I live and probably around the world, where Indigenous people continue to struggle day to day to live a reasonable life in many ways as individuals and as communities. And I think a really great way to sort of put yourself in a position over time to have those kind of conversations is to find ways to help out with those efforts and just make it a practice to do so on a regular basis.
Here's the thought I'm looking for. This is something we learned, I think, on one of these calls long ago, but Indigenous ways of knowing are often embedded in the language, the rituals, and the land, so that when even the languages go away, the rest starts to crumble and goes away with it. So one of the things that's really interesting about Sand Talk is that Yunkaporta says, like right up front, hey, I'm not trying to explain here Indigenous ways of knowing. This is not an explication. You're not going to understand necessarily, nor is it a critique of capitalism, but it's going to be a little tiny taste of both in some very interesting, open, wandering kind of way. And for me, it works really beautifully. I like that he sort of sets himself apart from those kinds of things. But I think we're so separated from the land and from each other that these concepts of connectedness are just alien to us. They're just alien to us, and the we got undermined systematically over time to the point where it's mostly I and my nuclear family, and that's all we've ended up caring about. It's very strange. Other thoughts?
I think Pete K should say what he put in the chat about cargo culting. Pete, will you take me up on that offer?
Yeah, sure. And in an irony, I have to say that I cargo culted that idea even. My friend Wendy Elford, our friend Wendy Elford, is one step or two steps closer than I am in speaking to Indigenous peoples, including Yunkaporta himself. And in conversations with her and other folks, I ended up feeling like there's a bunch of stuff that you just don't grok unless you're a little bit more centered in the context in which, you know, you need to be of the land, right? Not just, you know, hey, and I apologize for kind of picking on the person that said it, but they had great forest management practices. You know, it's like, what does that even mean in the context of the people who were living there for thousands and thousands of years? You know, forest management isn't a thing, right? It's, you know, we're all part of, you know, something greater or something like that. So I just want to, I guess this is a shift for me. You know, 6 months ago, a year ago, or something like that, it was much easier for me to be in conversations with people with faces that look like mine, who mostly live in, you know, same or similar cultural situations than I do, and mostly urban. It was much easier for me to hear, oh, we should learn from other cultures, and there are cultures that are doing cool things and stuff like that. And now it really hits me. It gives me a little bit of a stomachache to, you know, I'm reminded of the, you know, no talking about us without us. You know, it's like, gives me a stomachache.
Nothing about us without us. And so I'd love to just get a sense of, from whoever wants to jump in for a second, what does Indigenous mean to you? Just broadly, is this an important topic to you? Is it, how do you see it? How do you relate to it? Anything like that? Gil, your avatar always makes me think you've got your hand raised. Klaus.
Yeah, indigenous by definition means indigenous tribes, meaning people living on the land within their indigenous communities, American Indians or South Americans and so on. But I think for the purpose of this discussion or any discussion on indigenous, what we're really trying to link up to is what is their mindset, what is their spirit, that enabled these indigenous folks to live for thousands of years in harmony with their environment and with the world around them. And then take those insights and transfer them into today's world so they become meaningful in a sense of, obviously we can't manage forests today the way they were being managed over thousands of years of evolutionary time. Obviously, anything we do today has to consider that there are 8 billion people on the planet, and that we have to find ways to translate what we can understand in a spiritual sense, mostly from how indigenous people related to their world into today's world. But then when you go and you look into the folklore, into religions, into customs of any culture any old culture, whether that's Chinese or French or German or Japanese or whatever, there is an understanding of living in harmony with your environment, and to have seasons, and to align, your lifestyle, your diet, your habits with the needs to sustain an annual cycle. So this discussion is really, really new world, and I think we are finally coming to struggle with the idea that technology may have misled us or pushed us into the wrong path. And I think this is sort of reflective to what we're pondering here.
Very much. I think that certainly contributes. Stuart.
Yeah, so you asked a question about, indigenous, and to me, it's kind of, it just evokes pre-industrialization, pre-technology, just a much simpler way of living. And as I think about it and relate it to where we are currently, yeah, there are beautiful nuggets, but we're living, and Klaus alluded to this, we're living in a planet with 8 approaching 9 billion people, industrialized, and our thinking is just so very, very different. And as we look to the future, so many of us see potential calamity. And we're looking and grappling for answers. And the question is, are we going to have a soft landing, or is it going to be a really difficult and violent landing? And we're all trying to plan in that way. And there is no kind of central authority that's doing any kind of global planning. So we have a large challenge on our hands. I'm laughing because I don't know what else to do at this point in time, listening to all of the different vectors that we have. I'm almost glad that I'm almost 76 years old, as opposed to being, a youngster at this moment in time. What an amazing challenge. It wasn't bad enough before Ukraine, and now here we are. Let's throw this into the mix also.
Yeah, and it's also amazing. One of the things that shocked me a lot is how quickly Mariupol can look like Grozny. I mean, it just takes a bunch of intense shelling for a while, and all of a sudden the city is wiped out, and will need to be rebuilt from scratch if they do. I mean, they have to knock down everything because it's just been destroyed, and actively so, violently so, in some terrible way. So one of my hopes is that we start to realize again how interdependent we are and how interconnected we are. And if we did that, we'd realize that when I hurt someone else, I'm hurting myself, et cetera, et cetera. We know the narrative, I think, here because we care about these things. But in trying to rethink how science might work, one of my proposals was, what if scientists thought of their work and the things that they're working with as sacred in some simple sacred way? And then I'll add to that thought, why don't organized religions leave people with that feeling? Why, if organized religions control so much of the world's population, why are those people not reflecting this idea that we are deeply interrelated and interconnected and interdependent? Why does the opposite show up out of that? And I'm like left not understanding how that could happen. Doug?
Yeah, to me, I start with the word indigenous, which means kind of born in place. And what strikes me about a lot of conversations about indigenous is people are trying to leave where they are and pretend that they're living someplace different. To me, the claim from indigenous is to take really seriously where you live. The people, the culture, the land, right there, and be involved with it. And don't look for a way out into a fantasy conversation about a different place. I think that the thing about indigenous people is their ability to take seriously where they live. And I think that's what we need to do. So for example, if you live in an urban environment, a challenge coming up is how we're going to feed people in that urban environment. Get involved with that issue or some issue that pertains, that's defined really by the local conditions.
And taking action locally is going to make a big difference. Gil? Where'd that dang button go?
Sorry, I switched from iPad to laptop, and I couldn't understand why the screen control wasn't working.
Ah, good point.
Yeah. I think there was something I was going to say, but to Doug's point first, I think it's a very provocative notion that indigeneity is sort of time bound as well as place bound. You know, my ancestors lived on land somewhere else a long time ago, but I live here now. You know, and what kind of commitment can I make to where I live now and to living here and to acting from here? Wendell Berry said that, you know, Ken, you're going to probably remember the quote better than I do, but something about the place I stand is his stance in the world is the place that he stands on. He said it much more poetically than that. You know, a lot of people in the world have moved over time, have been, you know, in a place a long time that's not the place where they were before that. There have been conquests and vast movements of people. And one of the things that complicates, Jerry, maybe the great religions is that they've got, you know, many of them got bound up in empire and changed when they became part of empire and the dynamics of that. So I think I forgot the point that I was starting with. Yeah, I'll come back to something else later.
No worries. Thanks. Before I jump to Stuart, I just found this in my brain, just looking for thoughts about oneness, and it comes from this article by Mark Leary and Kate Diebels, The Psychological Implications of Believing that Everything is One, which I probably got from this Scientific American article by Scott Barry Kaufman. What would happen if everyone truly believed everything is one? And it has 6 levels of belief in oneness, and I'll just read them real quick because it seems useful. 1 is beyond surface appearances, everything is fundamentally one. Another is, although many seemingly separate things exist, they are all part of the same whole. Number 3, at the most basic level of reality, everything is one. 4, the separation among individual things is an illusion. In reality, everything is one. 5, everything is composed of the same basic substance, whether one thinks of it as spirit, consciousness, quantum processes, or whatever. And 6, the same basic essence permeates everything that exists. And I don't know that I would have organized them in 1 to 6 that way myself, sort of staring at the list, but I like the levels of granularity that it adds to our conversation. With that, over to Stuart.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that that the ennui, the discomfort, the huge discomfort that I think we're all feeling at this moment in time is that we were all kind of encultured or brought up in a certain way. And all of a sudden, at some point in time, the light bulb has gone off in so many of us that going forward, we need to be different. So we're actually, restructuring our own brains in a certain way, because that's the only way that we might survive as individuals, but also culture in the future. And it's not, it's a really challenging thing to do. One of the examples that came up, for example, and this is not in any shape or form a pejorative. Gil, you have been so active in the area of climate and such a concerned citizen. And then when you're thinking about a new venture, you thought in terms of capital and making it a business venture. And that's a great example of how our thinking has been structured and how we have to completely change that kind of thinking in certain ways. And it's a big challenge. And if you think about it, not just for people on this call who have some level of awareness, but so many people in the world without that level of awareness. I mean, it's just a huge, huge challenge.
Judy asked,
You put
go
your
ahead.
finger on part of the schizophrenia of my life, or the polarity of my life, which is trying to work inside the system to shift it in a way that's more life affirming or life sustaining, possibility allowing, and standing outside it and saying this is deeply fucked and needs to be completely burnt down and rebuilt from the ground up in a much sweeter way than Mariupol and so forth. But I think like a lot of us, I'm inside outside.
I think this is a perennial question. I had a housemate at Penn many years ago in grad school who was wonderful, and he was like the radical I was pretty sure was going to burn the thing from the outside. He ended up teaching at Heck and being a consultant within the system. It's really interesting how these things turn out. Mr. Homer.
So this is where Judy is asking about oneness. There's one school of thought that says oneness is a spiritual view. So spirit is associated with fire and air. It rises up, it gets above things. And when you rise up and get above things, you go, oh, everything is one. Isn't that lovely? Now, if we could all just recognize we're all one, we could actually make headway on getting through the world in a powerful way. But the problem is you can't live with spirit. Spirit has to come down and bond with the earth. It's water and earth seek the low places, and they divide into two, and it's self and other, and it's the entire world of dichotomies. And from that perspective, we're not all one. And so those polarities, every single one of us has to deal with of, I am myself, I am also part of a larger world, and yet I see people as very different from me, and they get under my skin and irritate the fuck out of me, and I have all kinds of problems with that. So we need a third way of resolving that, which actually we're designed for, because they have a heart brain that's about relationships. They have a limbic system that helps us to understand social constructions and how to relate to people. The problem, as Tyson would say, is that we've allowed narcissists to take over, and handling a narcissist always is a community effort. They're running loose in the world and creating all kinds of havoc because they believe they're not bound by the systems in which they're born. And we've got a real problem with that. There's a whole bunch of quotes I could pull up from the book that I've been writing. I have this tendency to quote things from books. So anyway, in the Chinese philosophy, you stand between heaven and earth. And so heaven is that unifying energy of oneness, and earth is the receptivity. And it is our job as human beings to walk through the world with power and grace and make the world a place worth living. And we've fallen out of that. I would say that's one of the biggest pieces of non-Indigenous thinking, is that we're separate from the world. That Alan Watts called it the porcelain model, where God created this world and put man in it and said, go ahead, run wild over this thing. That ain't the way it actually works. I love this quote from Brian Swim that, if you leave hydrogen gas alone to its own devices, it turns into giraffes and rosebuds and rose bushes and people. There is an intelligence at work. If you think about 4.2 billion years ago, this world was a molten ball of lava surrounded by a toxic cloud. And yet life has, in the last 4 billion years, brought forth everything that we see. There's an intelligence there. If we knew that we wouldn't fail by trusting that, what might we be able to tap into if we could start to channel our this incredible amount of intelligence that's behind us in every cell, mostly bacteria. There's way more bacteria in our bodies than there is human cells. There is an amazing coherence of an ability to take the world and make it work. But we, in our last couple hundred years, have really fallen away from that with industrialized thinking and being different from the world and apart from it. And that, to me, is takes us out of being indigenous. Indigenous means to belong to somewhere. Many cultures that are suffering right now don't have a sense of belonging in the world. They think the world is alien to them. And that's a real problem.
And also many of the cultures we see as indigenous have been driven off their lands long ago. I mean, certainly in the Americas, not so much in Australia, New Zealand, a few other places where they still live on the land. And in Australia, one could argue that it's because the land is so inhospitable that nobody wanted to shove them off it, although certainly mining concerns and everybody else thinks otherwise.
And
yeah.
I saw David Suzuki speak at Dominican University a few years ago, and he showed a picture of some Aboriginals at Uluru, which some people know as Ayers Rock, and they were there with these insects laid out in front of them. And these were insects that you could eat that would keep you alive. And Suzuki said, if we lose this, if this knowledge gets lost from humanity, it will be an amazing tragedy, because there may come a time when insects are all we have to eat. And, you know, in many indigenous cultures, time is cyclical. It keeps moving around. It keeps repeating itself. There have been Armageddons before. Armageddons are survivable if you know what to do. But we've lost a lot of that. Yeah, thanks, Pete, for pulling that up. I'm really intrigued with this ability to let go of everything I know that I've learned as a Norte Americano and open myself to a completely different way of thinking. And it's not easy, but you know, I have 30 plus years of practice on this. I've been doing this since I met Malidoma Somé in 1993. So it's hard. It's really, really challenging. And, you know, we're so entrenched in the empire colony mindset that we start talking about, oh, you know, we need to learn from indigenous people how to manage forests. Well, that's not what indigenous people do. They don't manage forests. You know, they live on the land in a way where the land and they are both alive and in an I-thou relationship, not an I-it relationship. So if we could get past that, if we can start to be in that I-thou relationship with the entire living world, it's an old saying, you know, all around you, the world is standing up and talking, and it's falling on your deaf ears. You know, how do we open our ears to what the world is saying to us? That's not a shift in mindset. That's a shift in way of being for me. All right, I'm done preaching.
Thanks, brother Homer.
And it's my birthday, by the way. So I'm.
Oh my God! Happy birthday!
Thank you.
Yay!
Medicare, baby. My health insurance just went down $7,000 a year.
I cannot wait. I cannot wait for that day. I am counting the hours. Judy, I'm glad you raised your hand. I was going to call on you anyway, so let me go through the queue on my way to you. Michael, Eric, Wendy, Judy. Yep.
Yeah. I was really struck by some interrelatedness that I just wanted to push together for us in some of the things that people have been asking and saying. And to Jerry's, you know, question about religion and why it doesn't, you know, do what you would think it would do. And Doug's points about locality, and Judy's, you know, question about oneness, and it really seems pretty clear. And when we're talking about indigenous cultures, or any culture, everything is one when you were in one place with one relationship to one natural world and one religion, culture / worldview. But as the world has grown, as Ken was saying, as we've risen above our oneness, and I would say with planes and ships and, you know, the ability to be in more places than the place that we were born. Our indigenous views have collided in war and misunderstanding, and the religions have served to say, but wait, our cultural narcissism, I know, we know the way, why don't you listen to us? Okay, I guess you're heathens and aliens and we'll have to kill you and conquer you to assert our oneness over your oneness. And the ones who were, the cultures that were better at conquering and asserting their oneness sent their missionaries and their soldiers to change what's there. And I just wonder about what practical way to post facto, to create a oneness out of the warring onenesses that are indigenous cultures. It's not like we can, even if we took two indigenous cultures that we respect and revere for their untouched originality, like if we took Australian Aboriginal culture and American, the peoples of this continent and their cultures, and tried to mush them together into a oneness, we'd find some overlap, but we'd probably, if those peoples had come in contact with each other and said, this is what this thing means and is for and is scarce and valuable, and you should think so too, and the other thought there was a different set of realities in oneness, there would have been conflict. And finding this, funny, highest common denominator, lowest common denominator, I don't know what to call it, but a oneness that we can all share, I agree is the ideal, but it seems almost, it's really incredibly hard to impose from the place that we're at, where we have too much access. To go be local again isn't even, if you could go and be local and indigenous with the people who lived the same off the same land, that'd be great. But to try and be local in a cosmopolitan, in a place like Brooklyn with cultures colliding already with worldviews that are different, to live as locally as you can still isn't to live like an indigenous culture would live. So I despair a little bit at that thought, but I just wonder if oneness is possible. And that's my thought.
That was sobering. Thanks, Michael. Eric?
So many threads. I am trying. One is, I remember, for me, opening up really weird and deep experiences. It was Castaneda. I already talked about him, but there's this podcast now about him. And he's kind of one of the people who opened us up to indigenous cultures. He was like a pop culture icon. He reached millions of people. He influenced a lot of rock stars and cinema people. And he was a trickster. He actually, during his life, it was they found out that probably most of what he's written, he actually wrote himself. He was a master storyteller, but it's still not clear what he made up and what might be real. But in my opinion, probably most of it is made up. And in the podcast, I put it in the chat to actually explain this bizarre guy. And then another level is there's so many people who have been influenced already by this. If you go and look at artists like Ensor here in Belgium, but any or Picasso or like these really famous artists a lot of them beginning 20th century, I guess. If you look at their chambers, their personal offices, a lot of it is masks and stuff like that, and they were deeply influenced already. Then this museum of the Musée du Quai Branly, it's in France. It's also weird in a way because it's my favorite museum. When I go there, I am deeply touched, and then you understand that that whole collection is most probably stolen. Then there's the whole issue with cultural appropriation, which is so weird, because actually I think if we are able to do those things, we can find deeper connection. But then there's all these people who do like shamanism and see themselves as shamans, and then there's all these weird and tricky dynamics with it, where it then becomes like an absolute truth, and whatever they pick up from the ether then becomes like your reality. And if you go to a general shaman right now in the Netherlands, I wonder how much they really know about indigenous people, and that's really painful in a way. They really, but at the same time, the experiences can be real. So it's a very weird ethical dilemma, I would say. And on one hand, I would like to find freedom. I think one part of it is documentation. How do we document, and what's the best way, and where does it happen, and how do I access it? I don't actually know where online you can find those kind of things in a beautiful way, for instance, but also how do we really reach the depth that those people have reached? It's like, yeah, there's so many questions there, but like Castaneda supposedly was one, because he started writing about his experiences and started taking away anthropology as a science and saying like, this science doesn't make any sense. You have to start from the stories of the people, which I think is a good point. But then too bad that he was a fraud in the end. I think going and living there and really experiencing and going deep does have value. I don't know how much practical value it has. It's such a slow process. And also there's so many indigenous cultures and oneness. I don't know. I had this experience of oneness, but once I understood it, gradually down the road, I understand, well, it's also about diversity. All these indigenous cultures have a very different kind of visual identity and beauty, and also depth in understanding certain aspects of our cosmology. I think the cosmological understanding of tribes often goes really deep, and it's into a level that we can't access because we have been conditioned in certain ways of thinking, and they've just had the stars. Like they were just like, I don't believe in astrology, but then the one thing that did make sense as an argument pro astrology is those people have been watching the stars and only had the stars for 40,000 years or whatever, like a very long stretch of time. And this experience is very deep. And for me, the questions of accessing this depth, of being in this kind of deep connection that goes with long time experience, that's a really good question. I don't think it's such, if we say it's inaccessible, then we actually close down that and then we can just put it in a museum and then it's like an artifact. But I think it's really about the experiences that we can have, and we can go deeper than we imagine.
Eric, thank you. That was really generative. And it took me in kind of two different directions. One was kind of this wistfulness, sadness, despair that we can't actually learn these indigenous cultures. We can't stay, and like understanding them kind of means joining their community and staying there for a very long time and being connected and committed. And then I went in a different direction, which was how might we invent, create, find, and nurture an interstellar sense of connectedness and community, something that fits our nomadic new lifestyles, et cetera, something that fits our easy access to zero marginal cost technology that lets us do funny things like this call, where every week for 2 years, we sit here in some small form of communion, which Pete has referred to as our reverie, which I love, Pete Kaminsky. And is there some way to transport this or enhance this or ritualize it or something else that makes it become more of what it could be and closer to that other thing that seems unreachable, seems very hard to find and get to? Wendy, then Judy.
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. I think this thread of conversation is really interesting. And I also want to honor, that we're really just scratching the surface. That I think this, for me, this conversation has stayed very much in the space of trying to understand what it is we're talking about. What I am most interested in actually talking about is what have we already learned or already sensed from Indigenous communities as lessons that we can now apply to what we're facing and to our daily lives. I'm not saying we've learned everything. We won't have ever learned everything, right? But in terms of using the parts of the patterns and model of behavior and community that they have provided to us. And I think we're each going to have a different perspective on that as well. Maybe some of us have had deeper experiences with learnings or with teachings or with shamans or with communities or with service to those communities in different ways. And so allowing for all of that and shifting the conversation to be more about what can we bring from what we've learned into what we're doing and what we're trying to do together or where we think we're going. I just think there's a lot of richness to be gained from shifting the conversation in that direction. And so for me, for one, my answer to that, I kind of put in chat a while back, but it's along the lines of the deep listening that happens. I've been thinking a lot about that actually in the last couple of weeks, and even just noticing it in movies that maybe have a scene in them of Indigenous people and Native people, and reminding myself of the incredible deep listening that these cultures often have, and not just listening with the ears, but listening with the senses, listening to each other, listening to body language, listening to the messages from the land, from the birds, from the air, from the sky, from the earth, listening to the cycles and rhythms of the seasons, and what is all, putting that all together as a running storyline of the balance of things, of the sense of things, of the imbalance of things, and reacting, living that way. I think there's a lot to be gained with all the changes that are coming for us. And now I mean the broader us, all of humanity, to be learning how to listen in that way so that we can respond more appropriately and more quickly to things before they become an all-out crisis. Thanks.
Thanks, Wendy. It feels like we should maybe stay with what's been said so far for just a moment in silence and hold it, and then we'll go to you next, Judy. I'll bring us back up. I spent this moment of silence just looking at your beautiful faces. Judy, please.
Not quite sure where to begin. I'm struck by the fact that even as we talk about oneness, we're instantiating in that the otherness as well. And how can we work with the otherness to change it? And I don't know if there's a way to be aware of otherness and acknowledge it and discern attributes without positioning it as otherness, such that we're all wanting fundamental values or something. And I know not everyone agrees about what the fundamental values would be, but it bothers me a bit that we're dichotomizing this. that there's the oneness and there's the otherness, and the attributes of those two groups are something that we have the power to influence. And saying that we might influence it is a sense of otherness, because we're putting ourselves above or outside the otherness. And I'm having a lot of trouble expressing this, but I'm just wondering if there's some way to embody oneness as an embracing of otherness rather than opposition to otherness, because the oneness is acknowledging, in a sense, the implicit differences, and despite that, a common bond that unites us. And it might be helpful to try to reframe in terms of not sort of the Western thought of what as we as Westerners, or we as who we are, can do to change the world, which tends to be the framework of the Western culture to our great detriment. But rather, how can we live in harmony, and how can we accept and build the unity that would help us move forward?
That is huge. And here we are, all of us with Indigenous blood from someplace, because our peeps came from somewhere, and were probably rooted on their land and probably knew what to do about it. But all of us disconnected and transient and in motion, trying to think about how not to other while talking about the other. So nicely put. John, then Michael, then Stuart.
Okay, well, many rich threads here, but one dichotomy that I'm aware of. This group is pretty extraordinary, and many of us have had experiences where we were invited to go beyond the superficial in terms of trying to understand an other. And I don't know the specifics, but I've known 10 shaman, most of them superficially, but I did get a chance to go deep at least twice. And I have a feeling that, Ken, a bunch of you, I get the same feeling. You've had deep experiences with Indigenous people, with other ways of knowing. So it sets up an opportunity and a challenge. The opportunity is we have the right, I hesitate to say this, but it'll jar you, and then you'll see what I mean. We have the right kind of wokeness, in a sense that we've all been in the position where we've overstepped and noticed that we've overstepped. So that's good. That's good. I used the word forest management earlier, and it went, it set off an alarm, because that is a perspective from the dominant culture looking at how to utilize another culture. So absolutely, we want that. We want to have that degree of sensitivity that says, whoop, wait, be careful about what you're doing here, and be willing to go in deep and spend the time and acknowledge the people, your own people and other people who have gone in deep and spent the time and done the work. Continue to do that, and notice what kind of communication you may have to have with the people who are not in this group, not just because they're Indigenous, but because they're not willing to spend the time. They're not going to go there, and they do want a short answer. And we're not going to give them a short answer, but we might want to talk to them with an awareness of what we can gain. I'm going to bring up, chapter 2 of Dawn of Everything. I'm going to, jump ahead because I know the book club is not there. We're going to talk about that soon, but chapter 2 of Dawn of Everything, the accounts by the Jesuits of what it was like, how they encountered the Native Americans, and they call them the Americans. Really interesting. They call them the Americans, and they call themselves the Europeans, which just accurately, exactly gets it right. And they're Jesuits, and they're struggling. They're struggling because you know, and there's this, I'm going to mispronounce this native's name. It's Kandiarak or something is what I recall. It sounds like I'm probably got the mistake, but apparently he was a native scholar who really was a great debater and took the Europeans, you know, like he just tied their shoelaces together because he was so able to catch them in their own contradictions. But a lesson that you can take from that if you step away is, wow, there's a whole range of ways of integrating otherness besides voting, you know, and we get hung up on, well, is it approval voting? Is it, you know, should we have this congressional district or that congressional district, you know, and clearly over the thousands of years, these cultures evolved a whole lot of ways to integrate weirdness, integrate their own weirdness and make it work and have a deep relationship and have thousands of conflicts which they didn't have to fight about. Yeah, of course they had fighting, you know, but I mean, there are many, many things that we get tremendously hung up about. We have a congressman jumping up and saying, I got this bill here to guard the border. I got this bill here to sue people who do this bad thing. And these cultures obviously did something else. They did something else that held them together as a community, that decided the important stuff, some of which we might have looked at and said that's forest management, but also managed to take the stuff that doesn't deserve that degree of public attention and got people to feel okay about it. So that's something I'm taking away from my attempt to understand those different cultures, and it presents us an option. I want to acknowledge that this group is an extraordinary resource in terms of how we do this, and also that we want to continue to think in terms of how do we communicate to the people who are not here, not just because of our incomplete attempts at diversity, but also because they don't want to be here because they're on another track. Thank you.
John, thank you. And just to pull on a tiny thread that you pointed to, there are so many alternatives to voting for decision making, but Western civilization as it currently stands, sort of liberal democracy plus capitalism plus whatever, seems to believe that if only we had perfect elections and every person had one vote, things would be okay. And the world of DAOs emerging on Web3 seems to think the same thing. If only we had smart contracts and people who could issue their one vote depending on per person or per dollar invested or, you know, digital currency invested in the DAO, everything would be okay. And indigenous cultures tell us that whoa, there's many other ways to make decisions that might be a lot better. I was pointing in my brain to something called sense of the meeting, which comes out of Quaker process, which is Quakers don't believe in oaths or voting. It's just part of Quakerism. They're like, nah, these oath things, not so good. We actually need to have deep conversations and listen to the people in the room. I attended a workshop given by Scott Peck years ago where a big piece of what he lectured about was the meaning of the word consensus. And we spoke for a while about what consensus means. And it turns out that there's lots of different ways of thinking about consensus, which include 100% agreement by everybody, which is nearly impossible all the time. And his definition of consensus was much more interesting and community-based. Sorry, so Michael, then Stuart.
This is so challenging. This is a bit related to what I was saying before, and I'm sorry to be hammering on sort of the same subject, but I was really struck by what Judy was saying about otherness and how that relates to these warring impulses that even in the efforts of people in this group outside, you know, in the technosphere. Well, let me just back up to, you know, thinking about how otherness begins at the level of the self to the family. You know, I am me, and there are these other beings that I'm close to. And then the family feels this otherness from the neighbors, and the neighbors feel otherness from the community and on up the scale. And the sense of otherness can be worked beyond in the loving environment of, yes, you are other than me, but we all need to get along in this low scale context. And when you get to the level of nations and entire, religions and things like that, it's less easy to do that. And our whole push in this sort of techno democratization, just the existence of first going from indigenous cultures and tribal cultures to commerce with other tribes and travel and communication and intercontinental communication and travel and now to the World Wide Web has been, what I was talking about first is obviously a hierarchy. My family is not going to have any communication without going up through the hierarchy with a family in another tribe, because whatever would happen between this tribe and that tribe would be negotiated by commerce or war or something. And now we revel in this wonderful equality we've built where one member of one family can communicate with another member of another family a world away. And shouldn't we all be able to create this uniculture? And we get that. I mean, I think as a number of people have said, cultures want to be different. And the thing that we think is wonderful about one indigenous culture or our own culture, somebody else would think was totally repulsive. And we want to allow for that. And in some ways, it means that we have to go back to that tree of that hierarchical way that allows one culture to be itself without knowing and without communicating and without having to negotiate a sameness with another culture a world away with a totally different set of realities. So I just, thinking of this sort of hit me hard in my feelings of anti-hierarchical equality for all. We should all, have the same, be the same, enjoy the same freedoms, enjoy all the samenesses that we should have. I don't know, maybe hierarchy is necessary to make things work. Ouch. Thanks. I just throw that out.
Thanks, Michael. And I've got a thought here. Hierarchies should be temporary and local, which is kind of under this this idea of non-hierarchical. There's a whole trope out there about there shouldn't be any hierarchies. And I've ended up, I think this is a good, is this a good one or a bad one? This is a famous essay about this, about the elites and leaderless organizations, but I've forgotten where I stand on this particular essay, but it's famous on the subject. I'll connect it to the thought for today's call. Stuart, and then Judy, you dropped out, you passed?
Yes.
Okay, Stuart.
I almost passed also, because listening to everyone, it takes your mind to so many different places. Just to pick up on what Michael was saying, but before that, John, I think we have to be careful about being self-congratulatory in this group, because that often leads in other groups that I've been into not so good a place in my experience. Michael, the idea of hierarchy and a leader to take us out of this morass, That's where I'm leaning towards, but I'm also equally leaning towards just the concept of emergence. You know, who knows how we got here from that molten mass? You know, nobody does. All right, in some sense, and where this conversation is taking me to is a desire to take some psychedelics to help figure it out going forward, because it gives you a headache when you think of all of the vectors that we're dealing with. And then, you know, you think about certain mystical experiences. The movie that got critically panned, where Johnny Depp played Tonto, it was a very, very mystical movie in a certain way, and commentary about indigenous culture and how you know, industrialized culture took indigenous people and put them into a diorama in a museum. It was strange but magical. And then this Jackson Browne song comes up called "For a Dancer," which ended up, the end of the song is, you know, you may think about why you were here, but you'll never really know. It's just kind of a supposition. So, wow, what a time to be alive. Oh, the last thing that I wanted to say was, when we talk about how interdependent we are and how we're all one, and in some ways there were probably lessons coming out of the war in Ukraine, of the folks that survived, that are emerging from basements right now, and took care of each other in that just awful context. That and the African American experience, in terms of how they have been able to survive. There's so much wisdom in the Black churches.
Thanks, Stuart. Super interesting. So much to this. Doug, then Pete. Okay.
So I'm going to say this the way it comes to me, which isn't quite logical, but I'm going to try. I'm struck in this conversation by how little is emerging about strategy of what actually to do, which I find myself trying to think about a lot. And my current logic is going like this. We have global problems, but we do not have global management. In history, the management emerges to cope with the problems that are emerging. So we're in a beginning of a phase of needing to move towards global management. And here is my kind of scenario of how this might happen, just made up. But it goes like this, that people, a guy or a girl in a major corporation says, look, this is wrong, what we're doing. It's not working. We've got to impose draconian restraints on the way our economy is working. And that person calls up a friend in another organization, and they agree that this is what's is a direction to go in. So they call up another person. Let's say they can create a network of 15 people across major organizations, and these are elite players, who are committed to the idea that things have to be really different. And they call a press conference and say this, and they propose some things that have to happen in the way we cut CO2 production, and the way the economy is working, and what to do to protect people who are hurt by the change. And so out of that group emerges a thrust towards global management. I actually cannot think of any other scenario that has a chance of success. And this one's still a long shot.
This one's still dicey. And I think there's an interesting conversation to be had here between people who are, I don't even know how to frame it, who are proponents of some kind of bottom-up synchronization, synchrony, of actions and intentions as opposed to top-down draconian management. But that's a huge Pandora's box to open as well. But thank you, Doug. Pete K, then Gil.
Thank you. What an amazing time to be alive. Amazing and interesting time to be alive. I feel like we're seeing like birth and death throes of some really interesting future, and I'm going to kind of do again the pitch that I do every once in a while about super scale social structures and things like this. When I grew up, it seemed like everything was set in stone, right? We had a two-party system in the US. We had newscasters on TV that were kind of keeping everybody like in the same social space, and everything was wonderful unless you were the wrong color or the wrong side of the tracks or whatever. It seemed very static. And the thing that I've learned in the past 10 or 20 years is that, things seem static in the scale of lifetimes, and it even kind of seems static in the scale of like 3, 4, 5 generations, right? If I remember back to the time of, my great grandparents or something like that, it's kind of the same structure. Capitalism was there. We were expanding into resource abundance instead of exhausting resource abundance, but we were doing resource, expanding into resources and all of that. If you look at a longer time frame, and maybe this is the pitch kind of behind Dawn of Everything, at a longer scale, this whole thing, it's like an experiment that social animals are participating in, not necessarily consciously, to make better and better society, right? So I want to talk a little bit about natural selection. We get taught in school, or I got taught in school, that there's this thing called evolution, and that means that you get animals that kind of change a little bit, and over time you get different animals that meet their environment better, or take over from other kinds of animals better, or something like that. A lot of that is kind of focused on individual selection. This alligator is better than that alligator, or this whale is better than that dolphin, or whatever, right? But if you think of natural selection as operating on groups of animals, and especially when you start getting social animals, where a wolf pack is not the same as one wolf. Elephant herd is not the same with its grandmas and stuff that remember where the watering holes are when there's a drought. An elephant herd is not the same thing as one elephant. And humans especially aren't the same as one human, right? We're not even, humans as a group aren't even the same as, like 10 or 20 or 100 humans in a little family cluster, in a bunch of shelters near a river or something like that. At scale, you get really weird effects, right? And the way I start to think of those weird effects, when we start getting city-states and great religions and feudalism and capitalism, those really big social structures compete with each other to try to win, right? And it's not like capitalism decide, hey, I'm going to go beat up feudalism, or I'm going to kill all the feudalists, or I'm going to kill all the pastoralists, or something like that. But in effect, that's kind of what happens, right? The people who get sucked into the capitalist vortex, or before that, the feudalist vortex, or before that, the pastoralist vortex, they participate in this super scale social structure that is marching down history, and changing and growing, and just the social structure itself and the way that the individuals underneath it glue themselves together change the dynamic of how that social structure can survive. So we ended up, now in 2022, we've got this, kind of capitalist monster on the loose, stomping around and doing things. The the interesting thing for me is that a lot of us, I feel like it's really hard to get out of the mindset of I'm myself, or I belong to a country, and the country's been here for 200 years, or the country's been here for 900 years, or whatever, right? All of this stuff is really active and changing, and the whole thing has been an experiment. And the folks here, it's super cool to work with y'all. We're trying to come up with better ways to hook people together so that we can change what we're doing. Thanks, Doug, for saying Indigenous kind of means living locally and making sure that things work locally. But also making enough change kind of everywhere multiplicatively so that we can turn this ship around. So the challenge, I guess, it seems daunting, is that it's a really big ship we've got to turn around. The excitement is, I feel like it kind of is. It's, we're moving pretty fast, I think, cycle time wise, thinking through how to do things and stuff like that. I had a really interesting conversation with Dave Witzel, who some of you know this week. And I was telling him about how excited I am about, dude, I figured out how humans work together. It's in these small focused teams. And the team itself has a lot of social connectivity, and it focuses on one thing really well. And then it interoperates, it connects with other small teams focused on something that does that thing really well, right? And they act as service providers to each other. They have cross commitments to each other. You can localize the weirdness. Thanks for whoever said the weirdness. Some people like to be governed one way and some people don't like to be governed that way. They need to be governed another way. So when you have a bunch of friends and people who trust each other working together, you get super performance. And he came from the other direction. Pete, I'm really interested in governance. And it kind of blew up my world, because I had this cool world where we all had these little federated sovereigns working together and everything was kumbaya. And we kind of talked a little bit, and it's like, oh, there's some really big things. The things that we call commons, like the air and the water and the soil, and how we make sure that everybody gets fed, not just the folks in the local environment. So then I'm like, okay, great. You're right. We need stewardship of these really big commons. So I think that, it's a new thing for me to think of and play with this week. So I haven't thought about it much, but it makes me realize that we have big institutions, often nations or states or things like that, that do sometimes a really good job of stewarding the commons, and sometimes a really, really, really crappy job of stewarding the commons. And now I'm thinking that, you don't necessarily want to leave your commons stewardship in the hands of a nation state. Maybe that's not the best organization to steward commons. So at some point, I hope, I guess, I think we're going to see these really probably small organizations managing a huge commons. So I'm excited about that. Thanks.
Dang, can we just bottle that? Pete, thank you. And it's so interesting in that one of my primitive beliefs is that the larger the organization and the more authority it has, the more it will be subjected to takeover. And once you've gotten the throat of the top of some very pyramidal hierarchical organization, you can create a lot of riot, like an illiterate peasant from the Republic of Georgia did in the Soviet Union back, during World War II and after. Like Stalin took over an extremely hierarchical organization, and millions and millions of people died because of it. So I'm pretty suspicious of large top-down kinds of structures, and they are honeypots for people who want to take them over and turn them to their own means, because hey, you can do that. It turns out that happens over and over and over again in our society. Let's go Gil, Doug, and then wrap out of the call. And Eric has some music he'd like to play for us on the way out of the call. So that'd be great. Eric Willikins. Sorry, Eric, right now. Go ahead, Gil.
So first of all, bravo, Pete. Bravo. I need some breath after that one. I expected you to throw one of your breathing things in there, Jerry.
Sorry about that. I could have taken this. I was tempted, but we're so close to the end of the call.
That's something to say. And I propose that the next call we start by replaying that Pete riff and then have a conversation off of that, because there's just so much gold in there. A couple of things. The way we talk about hierarchy versus flat, or top down versus bottom down, and the various dichotomies that people have used in the conversation, I think is wrong-headed and actually dangerous, because the world includes both. And there's a distinction that I like to make between the hierarchy of domination and the hierarchy of organization. I mean, this bag of skin that I'm walking around in has hierarchical organization. It has parts containing parts containing parts containing parts, but it's not a dominating organization where the brain rules or something rules, and we get lost in that because we're oriented to a world of domination hierarchy, and so we lose that distinction. I think lose something very important. There's been a bunch of irritation in this call about the word management. People challenging whether native peoples manage their landscapes, or rather than lived in the landscape, and that's maybe an artifact of how we use the word management. I like the word coordination better than management. And Norbert Wiener, when he did the book Cybernetics in 1948 or something like that, the subtitle was Communication and Control in whatever, Machines and Organizations or something like that. And I've always thought that should have been Communication and Coordination, because we have to find ways to work together. Control is not the only way to do that.
It's titled Cybernetics or Control of Communication in the Animal and the Machine, 1948.
Yeah, I was close, thank you.
You're very close.
Yay, brain. To your understandable concern about larger organizations, and I would say large organizations in the grip of different relationships of control, I don't know if there's any way to coordinate human beings around climate without global coordination. I don't think that gets done at village level. And in fact, one of the ongoing, 50+ year battles in the United States is about well, I'll just call it this way, certain business interests masquerading in the philosophy of states' rights, trying to block coordination at bigger levels around everything from culture to water. Water doesn't respect political boundaries. You're not going to manage water at state by state level. Boom, you're not. So there's that. This is very alive for me because it's a ongoing conversation in the cooperative and employee ownership movement, which I'm increasingly involved in, about how do you do democratic coordination in organizations. And it's very different in a company of 10 than in a company of 100,000 or 100. And so people are struggling with this in some very real and creative ways, live on the ground, in bakeries and machine shops and funding organizations, and now increasingly private equity funds and others. How do you do that? How do you take these ideas that we're talking about and make them alive on the ground in a functioning organization that has responsibility to deliver products and employ people and manage their health benefits and participate in society and so forth? And Ken, on my screen is shrunk. I don't know if Ken's still here, but I wonder if World Cafe has ever been used as a governance system, coordination system. I'm falling to the language myself. Has World Cafe ever been used as a coordination system within an ongoing organization, with ongoing functional commitments in the world? It's brilliant as people come together for conferences. That's where I've seen it. But I don't know if it's been used as an ongoing schema for that. And last, I'll just say, Pete, you talked about, it was the echo of the Gramsci quote from 100 years ago. The old order is dying and the new world is not yet, is struggling to be born. And in Zizek's translation of it, which is a little liberal, he said, now in between those is the time of monsters, the interregnum of monsters, not as like a bad thing, but as primal forces unleashed in an undifferentiated way where we don't know what's coming. So back to what Judy said earlier on about emergence, and maybe a call about emergence. That's where I am. Thank you for this. This has been delicious today.
Gil, I'm aware of some organizations that have used World Cafe for soliciting input for management, but I've never encountered an organization that's using it as a tool for governance. World Cafe is really great for creating shared understanding. It's great for exploring possibilities. It's great for learning and reflecting. It totally sucks for coordinating action among large numbers of people.
Okay.
Yeah, Gil, it's a really lightweight process. It doesn't include the kinds of things you'd need to actually sort of coordinate activity. I mean, you're drawing on tabletops, and somebody explains. It's very, very lightweight. And Ken, you run way deeper on it than I do, but I don't see it as a thing I would use to try to structure governance.
Yeah, I think, World Cafe is a part of a process. So I'm curious, and I would love to talk, Ken, with you and with anybody else who'd like to talk about it. Michael, you and I are up in about an hour or something, or half hour, to talk about what's possible in the realm of human coordination. I'm particularly focused right now on economic organizations, discrete economic organizations, but it lives at every level of the conversation that we're having. It's here, it's in the meta conversation we had yesterday, which sorry that we didn't get to reflect on today. But so I'm interested in talking more with people either in these sessions or individually about that. Pete, I got my eye on you also.
Which of the Pete's?
Okay,
yeah.
I don't know Pete well enough yet.
Thanks, Gil. Ken, do you want to say some more about that?
I don't know. The World Cafe, I don't see the World Cafe as lightweight. I think a lot of people who practice it are lightweight. I think it has it depends upon your ability to design. If you're a good designer and you know what you're after, you can use World Cafe to be an amazingly powerful tool. But I don't think a lot of people look at it that way. When I was there for 10 years. I started 25 years ago. I was there from 97 to 07. It was, can we create coherence among people? Can we have 1,000 people in a room and actually have them all engaged in a conversation that produces something useful? The answer is yes, but a lot of that depends on who's doing the facilitation of the design work. So I think it's actually a very powerful tool, but you have to understand what it's good for. And my own work on how does conversation get work accomplished? There are 4 different conversations that are required to take something from conception to completion. There are others, but the primary 4 are understanding, possibility, action, and reflection and learning. And World Cafe is really about at coordination of action. It's really good at soliciting shared understanding. It's really good at exploring possibilities. It's really good at reflecting and learning. So if you recognize that limitation, then you find other processes. You get build the shared understanding, you explore what's possible, then you find other processes for actually coordinating the actions of many, many people. And then you come back and reflect on what are we learning? How is this working? So I don't see it as lightweight. I see it as actually quite robust. But it's just one tool in many. And what I appreciate about it is it does allow for everybody to have an input, even if that input doesn't ultimately get to be part of the decision process. Every single person has the chance to speak. And because you have people at tables of 4, even highly introverted people have the opportunity to speak who wouldn't normally speak in a group. You mentioned they're drawing on tabletops. That almost never gets used. I have done art projects with that. I've had people take them, cut them up, and put them on the walls and cluster them to see a whole different level of understanding of what's been going on in the conversation. And almost no one, I don't know any other person in the World Cafe practitioners who's ever done that. So there's lots more to unpack in there, but that's just my riff on that.
I really appreciate that. Thank you. That helps a bunch. Gil, do you want to say anything else?
Just Ken, it sounds like World Cafe speaks very well to number 1 and number 2, but then maybe number 4, but not number 3.
Correct.
So there's an opportunity there. And as far as the tabletops, do those ever get harvested in a systematic way?
I am the only practitioner I know of who has ever harvested the tabletops the way that I've done. I've actually had people cut, because they're all chaotic. So I have people cut up what feels and put them on the wall with tape and cluster them and say, wow, look at these patterns that were going on that we never even were aware of, because it's kind of like the chat feature here on Zoom, where you may or may not be looking at that, or you might go back to it later on. But when you actually have the whole group take it and go, wow, look at these patterns that are also occurring while we're speaking, there's a richness there. So anyway.
So yay to you, and that proves your point about it depends on the practitioner. So
Yes.
there you go. So what about a plan where there's a World Cafe for a day or whatever it is, and all this stuff gets done, and one or two are very rich, and there's tabletops, and at the end of the day they get put up on the wall, and people go out and party and go to sleep, and come back the next morning and harvest actions and commitments from that.
Yes.
And have some other process that puts a plan, Doug, to your point, puts a plan in motion with accountabilities and et cetera, and then at some other point, or both at some other point together and in an ongoing structure, there's reflection on how we doing.
Yeah, I don't want to take a lot of time on this, so I will say one of the things I was engaged in Taiwan back in 2007 was we did this where because everybody in Taiwan is an artist because they have a character-driven language. So everyone drew amazing things on their tabletops. We had a team put them all up on the wall overnight. We brought people in the morning the next day and said, take a look at what you're seeing here. And then we're going to do an open space. And we're going to ask you to look at this and say, the conversation I am really interested in hosting is on how to take this and move it into that, right? And then people clustered, and sometimes if there was a big group, they'd break into 4 or 5 tables of small people, not smaller people, smaller groups, and they went through. Okay, here's how we're gonna take what's come up here and move it into the action phase. So that's a way of combining World Cafe and open space in a very powerful synergistic method that allows you to take really huge amounts of input and bring it down into small coordinated groups who are then going to take the action to make something happen.
Love that, Ken. And thank you. You're just like a fount of stories of innovation and humans doing stuff together. I love that. I wish we could just like do the Vulcan mind meld and yeah. Doug, you'll have the last word. And as you get close to ending, Eric will have the last note.
Well, I feel we have a conversation topic coming up here, which is group process.
Yeah.
Ken just mentioned open space. I did an open space with Harrison Owen with 450 federal employees for 4 days. And it's an amazing story, not for now, but maybe for the next time. It's a very powerful technique that could be used to manage very large enterprises.
Absolutely. I did a workshop run by Harrison Owen. So I learned to facilitate it from him way back in the day, and it changed my life in a bunch of really interesting ways. So with that, I think we're rounding up the conversation. That's Eric's cue to start some music.
Yeah, and just knowing that there's sense making on one end, and then there's this other space. If my play button will respond to my clicking. So I wish you all a very good weekend. It was nice to talk, it was nice to connect, and I hope we can feel all a bit one-ish right now. See you later, everyone.
Thanks, Eric. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Let's elaborate this topic on the Mattermost channel so that we have it a little bit more focused when we talk in 2 weeks. This sounds like a great topic. So thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Good to see you all.
Good to see you.